In this section, we're going to be looking at evolution, and specifically how evolution ties into evolutionary psychology. Now, when we're studying evolutionary psychology, we're asking the question, how have behavioral abilities and tendencies evolved in response to environmental demands? So instead of normal evolution, where you're looking at usually some sort of evolution of a physical trait, something like how have human brains gotten larger over time, which we'll come back to, we're looking at things that relate to psychology, things like behaviors, ways that we act. From all of the things that we've talked about so far, talking about personality and intelligence, we've figured out, or we should have figured out by now, that behavior comes, at least in part, from some sort of biologically based mechanism. So we've been able to point to different behaviors, different aspects of personality and intelligence, and say that there is a genetic component. And that genetic component is probably related to these biologically based mechanisms that in turn influence our behavior. So those biologically based mechanisms are things that receive input from our environment, process information, and help us respond. So we know that we have some innate systems that are allowing us to interact with our world. We have things like our language acquisition systems, how we learn to talk and continue to speak and communicate with others. We have an ability to learn and remember, and the way that our brains are set up, we have structures that help us learn and remember different things. So these systems have a biological basis, they have a genetic component, but they also have a strong influence on the behaviors that we're interested in. So when we're looking at evolutionary psychology, we're looking at how those biologically based systems are evolving, and in turn, how the behaviors that they influence evolve as well. So we're keeping in mind that the behaviors themselves aren't directly evolving. The genetically produced physical structures that interact with the environment is what's evolving, and those also influence our behaviors, so the behaviors change sort of in step with the genetic and biological changes that are happening. So a slight clarification of what specifically the evolution is acting upon. But before we spend too much time talking about that, I suppose we should take a moment and actually talk about the theory of evolution itself, because the term has come up a couple of times in this course, but we haven't really gone into the nitty-gritty of how it actually works. So evolution is simply a slow change in the genes of a population over time. And like we just said, as the genes change, the behaviors and the characteristics and the things that are related to those genes also change. Another thing to point out here is that when we talk about evolution, we're using the term population, which we've used before when talking about research studies and trying to make sure that you have a representative sample. When we're looking at evolution, we're actually going to be taking a more biological interpretation of population. So here, our definition of population is an interbreeding set of individuals, because usually when you talk about evolution, you're in the field of biology and you're trying to look at a population, a whole, usually species, of one particular type of organism and how that population is changing over time. So we describe an interbreeding set of individuals to basically say this group that we are studying. So a similar kind of definition to what we've called population before, but with a biological spin to it. So when evolution is happening, we're saying that the genes, the genetic makeup of the group of inbreeding or organisms that we're looking at is going to change slowly over time. So we should have some kind of awareness of where this change comes from. So the first thing that you need is that there should be differences in the genetic material available within that population. So we can call these changes sort of heritable genetic mutations. Heritable because they're something that's going to be passed on to other organisms. So you want it to be something that you can pass on to offspring. And genetic because it's in the genes, and mutations just being mistakes or errors that are happening within the genes of interest. So mutations are mostly going to happen when there are errors, when DNA is being copied so that cells can divide. Because in order for our cells to divide, we have to make a copy of our whole genome. And that's a long process, and mistakes can be made. There can be errors when the cells divide. Maybe different chromosomes don't separate where they're supposed to, so you can end up with extra copies of things. And you can have random events that will change genetic code. Things like exposure to UV can cause different segments of your genes, different segments of your DNA to stick together, and they might be repaired in a fashion that changes what was there to begin with. If those changes, if those errors cause a change in the function of the gene that we care about, so maybe the code changes and causes the protein that it produces to be a different shape, then we might see an effect on the organism. Now, it's kind of neat to note that these changes are going to only matter if they occur in cells that you can pass on to your offspring. So during our lives, we have lots and lots of small mutations, usually that have very little effect on our existence, that happen throughout our bodies. But those changes are fairly irrelevant. It doesn't matter if the cell in your arm, one of your skin cells in your arm has mutated, because you're not passing on that specific cell's DNA. It's really only going to matter if one of these mutations happens in one of the sex cells, so cells that become either sperm or egg that could then be passed on to your future children. If there's a mutation in those sorts of cells, then all of the cells that make up the child that is produced from them will then have that mutation. So that's when it becomes heritable. So only certain mutations, we're only going to be interested in certain mutations because not all mutations are able to be passed on. So when we're talking about changes due to heritable genetic mutations, they have to be something that can be passed on, so they have to affect the sex cells, the ones that produce either sperm or egg, and they're going to have an effect on the organisms. They're going to have to change some aspect of your functioning. So changing the structure of a gene, maybe. Oop, too far. Now, the fact that these changes, these mutations exist, in and of itself doesn't really mean anything. That isn't quite evolution yet. What has to happen is that there should be an effect caused by that mutation. So that mutation should either have a positive or a negative effect on your survival. Now, usually, the word mutation has a negative connotation. People tend to assume that mutations are bad. But in fact, mutations can be good or bad or neutral depending on where they're happening. Most mutations are going to fall in non-coding areas of our DNA and usually don't have a huge effect. So we don't really care about those because they're not changing anything. They're not producing a change in our physical traits. They're not producing a change in our behaviors. So there's no difference for natural selection to act on. What we care about are the good and the bad mutations. So we can talk about good ones where they have some sort of benefit to the organism that has them. So maybe there's a mutation that makes you better at surviving in a desert environment. And lo and behold, you live in a desert environment. So that mutation is good because it's going to help you survive in that environment. If you have a mutation that makes it harder for you to live, that would be a bad mutation, and it's going to be very difficult to survive if you have that mutation. This is where natural selection comes in, where Natural selection is just the process where those good mutations, the ones that make it easier for you to survive, those are going to become more common in the population because having them means that you survive longer, you can reproduce more, and more organisms are going to survive that have that mutation. In contrast, the bad mutations, the ones that make it harder to live, are going to get removed from the population because if you have them, you're more likely to die off. You're not going to survive long enough to reproduce, and those mutations get removed from the population. So to read it off the slide, natural selection happens when those heritable characteristics that are increasing your likelihood of survival are going to remain in the population and become more common over time. The good ones mean that you don't die, so you're going to be passing on more genes than those that do die. So the good mutations survive longer, you survive longer, and those mutations become more common in the population. Bad genes or bad mutations in the genes can cause you to live a shorter life, reproduce less, and those genes will eventually be removed from the population. And we can talk specifically about adaptations, which is the name for the traits that occur due to natural selection. So if you have that mutation that makes it easier for you to survive in the desert, maybe you don't need as much water, that lack of needing water is an adaptation because it allowed you to survive better in your desert environment. Now, as per usual, for those who like a visual representation, we can actually walk through natural selection happening and we can see evolution in this population of beetles. So we can look at these, I'm going to call them crows because they're black birds. So we can say that these birds like eating green beetles. And so in this population of beetles, most beetles are green. So probably the natural state of this population is to be green. But there are a couple of orange beetles who maybe have a mutation that affects the pigment that they produce. So that mutation makes them slightly different colored. And usually the color of these beetles doesn't matter, but these crows are applying what's called a selective pressure because they're going to go in and they're going to eat green beetles. So in this case, being green is actually detrimental to survival. And suddenly being orange could be considered an adaptation because the crows aren't eating orange beetles. So by chance, a couple of beetles got mutations that made them orange, and now this selective pressure is making it good to be orange in this population. So after some time, many generations later, we can see that there are more orange beetles in this population because the crows keep eating all the green beetles. And over time, if these crows are eating enough beetles, after many and many generations, as more and more beetles are born, only the orange ones are left alone to reproduce. So these ones reproduce more, and the gene, the mutation to the gene that produces pigments that makes orange pigments, means that these orange beetles now make up the whole population. So this population evolved from mostly green to now mostly orange pigmented beetles because of the selective pressure put on them by the crows eating all the green beetles. So being orange is an adaptation that allowed the beetles who are orange to survive and reproduce better in this environment. Now, when we're looking at behaviors and things related to psychology, it's a little bit more difficult to see, but one of the main places that we've seen this kind of evolution with humans, we can see the physical effects of it by looking at brains, or specifically the skulls that would house brains. So as humans have evolved, as we've progressed through all of our most common recent ancestors, so we can track back skulls of human ancestors 4 million years into the past, and we can sort of check in periodically through this evolution process to see how our skulls have changed in size and shape, and by looking at those, see how large brains were at the time. And we can find that there's quite a bit of growth, especially in areas associated with higher mental processes. So, specifically, areas that help us with attention, memory, thought, and language. So, we have lots of growth, mostly in the outer cortices. So, the parts of our brain that allow us to do things that are a little bit more complex. Now, if we think about why this might have happened, we can think about the environment that these ancestors were growing in. Our ancestors lived in very adaptive and changing environments, so critical thinking, problem solving, and learning ability would have helped them survive. There should have been a selective pressure so that individuals who were better at doing those things, who were better at critical thinking and problem solving and learning, would survive and reproduce and pass on any genes that might have been related to learning and thinking and problem solving. So over time, this population of pre-humans would have become smarter and better at problem solving and better at thinking because of natural selection. And because the parts of the brain that are associated with those sorts of skills are those outer areas of the brain, we can see that our brains would have gotten bigger over time because of this selective pressure. We should also keep in mind that it isn't just the environmental pressures that are pushing this kind of evolution. We also have cultural evolution playing a role here. So we should be aware that our brains, so us currently here on the far right, Homo sapiens, our brains aren't all that different from Neanderthals, our most close relative that we have on this chart here. In fact, Neanderthal brains are a little bit larger than our brains. Ours are just a little bit more, you can see we have more convolutions, all the little curves and rolls and crevices. So we have lots of surface area for all of our extra thinking, but in terms of mass, Neanderthals had larger brains than we did. But our abilities are beyond what they were capable of. So we can consider the idea of cultural evolution here, where we're learning things from the people that we're interacting with. We don't have to reinvent ideas every time we think of them. You can learn something by reading a book. And that book is information that has come from other people and the things that they've learned. So we have this passing on and sharing of knowledge so that we kind of have a head start from having to learn everything from scratch. We can learn things directly from others. We can learn things culturally. So that shared pool of knowledge helps us have that advantage. And the ability to learn from that shared pool of knowledge comes from all of these complicated convolutions in our brain with our advances in the areas associated with higher mental processes. So it's all tied together. We have the sort of physical evolution where we can see the biology changing, and then also our culture has changed in response, and we have cultural evolution because our capacity is changing. So there's lots going on here, lots of different aspects to consider. Now, when we talk about the different types of adaptations that we can have, the different traits or characteristics or things that come out of natural selection, we can talk about two types of categories. We can have broad adaptations, things that are widely usable, things like having smarter brains, the ability to have more complex logical reasoning. So those are things that could help us with learning a language, with logical reasoning. The brain overall hasn't evolved for one specific task. It's evolved a broad application that we can use in a lot of different areas. So some adaptations are more broadly applicable. But we also run into some domain-specific adaptations, so adaptations that happen to solve very specific problems. So we have systems that help us with mate selection or choosing safe food. You may have noticed that there are certain types of food that maybe you ate something when you were younger and it made you sick, and now you have a terrible aversion to that food. That's a very domain specific system that helps us try and avoid foods that have made us sick in the past. We also have parts of our brain that light up just when they see human faces. So that would be a domain specific adaptation because it's helpful, but only helpful when we're specifically looking at human faces. So our adaptations can fall into those two categories. And we've already kind of touched on this, but we have adaptations that are specifically in place because of our social nature. I've already talked about the responsiveness to human faces. We have evolved and adapted to living in social groups where we have to see other humans. So we have these adaptations that allow us to function better in social groups. We've evolved an innate ability to acquire language, where it's easier for children to pick up languages. And in fact, from birth, human babies are able to make sounds that can be heard in all languages around the world. It's only as we grow up and learn the specific language that our parents speak that we start losing the ability to produce the sounds that make up other languages. So from birth, we have systems that help us do better and do well at acquiring all types of human language. We also innately exhibit group-seeking behavior. Children will want to be around other people. They will cry to have people around them. And we also have some evidence for universal emotions. And when we get into the chapter on motivation and emotion, we'll talk about the fact that there seems to be a biological underpinning to emotion. There might be something genetic in emotions. And if there's a genetic component, evolution and natural selection can happen there. So we have lots of different things that humans have evolved to be good at, specifically because we're human, or because we are social creatures. So we get good at interacting with other humans and being in situations with humans. And there is even some idea that our personality has a genetic component and that evolution might be acting upon or might be occurring within those genes that affect personality. Our evidence here is that there are fairly limited dimensions to personality. We'll talk about it throughout the course, but there are those 5 major sliders in personality, 5 major features that differ within people in personality. And these 5 dimensions seem to be fairly universal. We see them in multiple cultures around the world, which gives us some evidence that if they're consistent between cultures and between countries and between people, then there must be that genetic component, and therefore they might have evolved for a specific reason. And there are quite a few theories that propose that these different dimensions exist because they facilitate core behaviors that are related to us surviving and reproducing. So having a mix of people who are outgoing, extroverted, and not outgoing, who are more introverted, helps have a stable society, a stable group, and that would help facilitate the survival of the whole group. Personality theory, especially looking at the evolution side of things, is a very, very interesting area. I wish we could spend more time on it, but that's all we really have room for today.